Imagine a ruler who looks out over a prosperous country one morning and deliberately decides to destroy it, not out of weakness, not out of incompetence, but because, by his calculation, that's exactly how he'll hold power longest. It sounds like paranoia, like conspiracy thinking, like something that simply cannot be true, because it contradicts the very logic of governance. Who needs hungry, embittered, ruined subjects? But here's the paradox. Hungry, embittered, and ruined subjects, under certain conditions, are far easier to govern than prosperous, independent ones. And this isn't theory, it's history. History that just isn't usually told straight. Over the past few centuries, there have been at least several cases where economic upheaval didn't merely coincide with the consolidation of power. It was the instrument of it, an instrument so refined that most of the people living through it genuinely had no idea what was happening. They saw the crisis. They never saw its architect. To understand how this works, you first need to let go of one deeply ingrained assumption. We tend to think that a ruler has a natural interest in his country's prosperity. Rich country, strong ruler. Poor country, weak ruler. Logical, intuitive, and, in certain situations, fundamentally wrong. Because that equation only holds when a country's wealth and a ruler's power actually depend on each other. But there are regimes where no such connection exists, where power rests not on gratitude or social contract, but on a monopoly of force, on control over resources, on managed fear. In systems like that, an economic crisis isn't a threat to the ruler, it's his ally. Follow the logic. When an economy grows, so do independent entrepreneurs, independent media, independent political movements. A middle class emerges, people with something to lose, people who start demanding a say in how things are run. Horizontal ties form between citizens, professional associations, civic organizations, cultural life. All of it creates alternative centers of influence, and all of it threatens the monopoly of power. Now, look at what happens when the economy collapses. The middle class disappears first. Small businesses shut down. Independent outlets lose their funding. Horizontal ties snap. Everyone is focused on survival, not solidarity. And in that moment, the state, as the only major employer, the only source of subsidies, the only distributor of resources, becomes absolutely indispensable. The population's dependence on power spikes. That's the first mechanism. Call it simply crisis as a tool of dependency. But that's not even the most interesting part. The second mechanism is subtler and crueler. A crisis gives the ruler a pretext for measures that would be unthinkable in ordinary times. States of emergency, fast-tracked legislation, curtailed rights. The concentration of executive authority in a single pair of hands. Under normal circumstances, this would meet resistance, but when the country is on fire, people beg, do whatever it takes. Just make it stop. Carl Schmitt, the German jurist whose ideas were, unfortunately, extremely well understood by people in power, put it bluntly. The sovereign is whoever decides in a state of exception. Crisis creates the state of exception, and whoever controls the crisis controls sovereignty. Now, the most uncomfortable question. Did anyone actually manufacture crises from scratch, deliberately? The honest answer? Rarely from scratch. More often, differently. Existing crises were intentionally deepened. Exits from crises were intentionally delayed. Measures that could have eased the situation were quietly shelved, because an eased situation was inconvenient. A sharp one was useful. One of the most instructive examples is the shock therapy policy that several international institutions pushed onto developing countries throughout the 1980s and 90s. Rapid liberalization, elimination of subsidies, privatization in the middle of economic chaos. Officially, a prescription for recovery. In practice, in several cases, it resulted in a country's assets being bought up at fire sale prices by a narrow circle of people connected to power. The crisis redistributed property, not in favor of the population. Naomi Klein called it the shock doctrine, the core idea, the structural changes that truly matter, the ones that shift wealth toward elites, are only possible in a moment of upheaval. Because only then is society disoriented enough to miss what's actually happening. And by the time it comes to its senses, the redistribution is already done. But let's raise the stakes higher still, because there's a level at which this worked not merely as resource redistribution, but as a full instrument of political control over entire nations. Weimar Germany. The hyperinflation of 1923. When a loaf of bread cost billions of marks and people hauled their money in wheelbarrows, this wasn't just an economic collapse. It was the moment the country's middle class was annihilated as a political force. Savings wiped out, independence gone, trust in existing institutions destroyed. Into that vacuum stepped those who offered simple answers, a firm hand, and someone to blame. Not because they were right, because they were the only ones speaking with confidence when everything else had fallen apart. The crisis didn't merely weaken democracy in Germany. It created conditions in which democracy came to be seen as synonymous with chaos, and order synonymous with authoritarianism. That was the real redistribution, not of money, of meaning. This is where the darkest part of the story hides, because the most sophisticated use of a crisis isn't simply to impoverish the population. It's to rewrite the equation in people's minds between freedom and security, to make them choose order over rights of their own accord, to make them ask for exactly the kind of control they would have rejected with fury under any other circumstances. It works through a simple psychological mechanism. When a person faces acute scarcity of food, money, stability, their planning horizon collapses. They stop thinking about freedom of speech, separation of powers, long-term institutional guarantees. They think about getting through today. And whoever offers a solution for today earns their loyalty, without conditions. An economic crisis is a time machine in reverse. It sends people back to a state of primary dependence, where any source of resources feels like a benefactor. And you don't overthrow a benefactor. You protect one. The resolution of this story is deeply paradoxical. The most successful applications of this strategy are precisely the ones least talked about, because when it works perfectly, the population sees neither the architect nor the design. They see only the crisis and the person who saves them from it. Often the same person or the same system, just appearing at different moments. The crisis creates the problem. Power arrives with the solution. The population is grateful. Power is consolidated. The circle closes. And here is what matters most. This doesn't mean every economic crisis is a conspiracy. Most crises emerge from incompetence, structural contradictions, and collective blind spots. But it means something else. A crisis is always the moment of maximum societal vulnerability. And in that moment, those with access to the levers of control always face a choice: soften the blow or exploit it. History shows that choice has been made in different ways, and the most frightening version isn't the one where power openly represses. It's the one where power engineers conditions in which people come to it for salvation, voluntarily, gratefully, without understanding what they're giving away in return. The most effective control is the kind that looks like help.
If you want to know more about this topic, subscribe to our channel.